Hello, everyone. For several years, doing my live and my recorded videos on YouTube or wherever, I've been talking about the different things that my dad taught me. And last week, actually, one of the subscribers asked to hear from Dad. The YouTube comment basically said, "Your father seems like a very wise man. Would love to hear more of his invaluable words of wisdom." Now, I've been trying to get him to start a YouTube channel for a while, but he won't sit still long enough to do that. So here's an interview. And for those who want to hear from the elders, at least the one that raised me. So I want to do a caveat first of all. The words of opinions of Mr. Peel are not necessarily the same as your hostess. We're alike in some ways, but we're not alike in other ways. So with that in mind, I'm going to start asking questions and I'm going to let him answer the questions. Okay, first of all, tell me a little bit about your background, Dad.
Well, I was raised in Detroit, and at this stage, I'm 81 years old. Uh, I grew up making things, and I love making things. And I became a tool maker in Detroit. So I made many, many things, and a lot of them, most of them are different things. Always done custom kind of work. What else can I say about me?
Okay, well, that's good. That's good. Whatever you want to say. So now you taught me to be who I am. You used to tell people that you raised me in such a way that if you dropped me out of a helicopter on a banana peel in the middle of Siberia, then I would still survive and thrive. Now, why and how did you raise me that way?
Well, the why was I didn't ever want you to feel like you was so dependent on anything or anybody that you had to stay there because you didn't have any place to go or you didn't know how to maneuver for yourself. That's the why of it, but how? By making everything as a challenge. So you grew up, everything didn't look like a mistake or a blessing. It looked like a challenge. So you would approach it with an open mind. And with an open mind, you could overcome anything, but you got to have an open mind and have confidence in yourself. That's what was in my mind when I was going through that.
Now, when I got carted off to prison, one of the things you said before they locked me up right in the courtroom was, you need to make this a university. And you mentioned Nelson Mandela. Tell me about that, why you thought about that when I was going in.
Well, I've been to South Africa a couple of times, and I had 45 minutes one-on-one with Mr. Walter Sisulu. And during the conversations, we exchanged a lot of stuff. It's like he took the top off my head and sprinkled some stuff in there that made me 10 feet taller than I was. Um, but when we were waiting for Mr. Mandela to come into the office so we could all meet together. And when Mandela came in, I said to Mr. Sisulu, I said, there's one thing that I don't understand. And he said, well, what is that, William? I said, well, how in the hell can you put a man in jail for 36 years or whatever it was, and he still come out not bitter? And Mr. Sisulu, he chuckled and he said, William, you people call it a jail. We call it a university. So when I realized Sherry was going to be gone, well, she spent 4 years in college. So instead of worrying about being there, I said, find something else to study. And within 4 years, you'll be a lot smarter and it would be a lot easier to go through the 4 years. And I've always taught her, don't run from something. I mean, don't run away from anything, always run towards something. So if you use those 2 years like a university, as Mr. Sasulu said, then it'll make it a lot easier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot of different words of wisdom or sprinkles of wisdom that I've learned over the years, and I found out that some of them came from my grandparents and probably from my great grandparents. So we're going to talk about a few of those. First one I want to talk about is tell me about the wisdom of delayed gratification.
Well, I used to make things, to try to make things, and then they wouldn't work, just like I wanted them to work. So instead of me just tossing the whole thing to the side, I'd work with it a little longer and work with it a little longer, and eventually it would work. And as I teach my great grandchildren now, grandchildren and great grandchildren, anything you work will work, but you got to work it. Because if you're not willing to work it, it's not going to work. So a lot of that is inside you,
Mm-hmm.
and that's true. And I used to go through it all the time. Delayed gratification is when you don't have to be successful right now, but you look what you want to be successful at, and it might take you a little time to get to that point. But when you get to that point, you'll be overjoyed because you worked at it, and it's you coming out that is actually making it work.
And the thing about that is you didn't give up. So let's talk about keep getting up.
Well, when I was a little kid, I used to take all my every Christmas before I get into playing with my toys. I take them all apart to see what made them work. And my father sometimes had to help me put them back together. Most of the time, I could do it myself. But my father would say, the thing you have to do in life is just keep getting up. And I'm trying to figure out, well, why do I have to be down? you know, but at first, he didn't explain to me, well, life gonna get you down. But what you have to do, the most important thing for you to do is when you find yourself down, just keep getting up, getting up. And I thought that was something simple, but when life gets you down, and it will get you down, then you have to find a way to get up. You don't have time to wallow in that and worry about how you got there. It don't matter how you got there. What you have to do is just keep getting up.
Okay, so when I was younger and I was, grumbling and complaining, you used to say, you can't complain in this house. If you don't like where you are at point A, go to point B.
That's right.
So let's talk about that.
Well, when you grow up with seven siblings in a two-bedroom house, there is a lot of closeness, a lot of closeness. And you have to learn to get along because we weren't allowed to argue with each other. We could disagree, and we wasn't allowed to call each other names or any of that. So a lot of times we just grab each other and walk out in the backyard so our parents couldn't hear us, so we could really get down to the nitty gritty of what our complaints were without them knowing it. And then I, in turn, did the same thing with my children. You know, I remember one time when dishwashers first came out, I'm fine. I went and got a dishwasher and I installed it in the kitchen. And I thought everything would be a lot better, but they just argued more about who was going to put the dishes in the dishwasher. So I went in and I uninstalled the dishwasher and just set it on the back porch and let them go back to washing dishes. And after they got it, they said, Daddy, just put it back. We can have the argument. And they used to grab each other and go outside like we did. The other thing they had, we didn't watch a lot of TV in my house. So Sherry had one program that she could look at, and Billy had one program that he could look at. And if they were good, they could look at a program together that they chose. But even with that, I would see them. My grandmother taught me to look like this, not like this. So I could see them out of the corner of my eye. And either Sherry would grab Billy's hand or Billy would grab Sherry's hand and they go outside. And when they come back in, it was settled.
Okay.
So they didn't argue together. They would debate and they would negotiate. And then they would come up with a solution.
Okay, so tell me about the saying that your mother told you, if it ain't in the batter, it ain't coming out in the cake.
Well, that was my grandmother.
Okay.
My birthday was April the 12th. My oldest sister's birthday was April the 10th. And my grandmother was making a cake for my oldest sister, and it was a rainbow cake. And, I knew shapes and figures and all of that. So I told Big Mama, I said, well, Big Mama, when my birthday comes, I want you to make me a checkerboard cake. And she said, okay, just like that. And I couldn't figure out how she was going to do that. I understood the layers in the rainbow cake, but I didn't understand how she was going to get a checkerboard cake. So I was sitting there and I was wondering. And so I said, how you going to make how you going to make a checkerboard cake? And she said, well, you'll see when I make it. And the more I stood there, the more it confused me. So I finally said, Big Mom, take a little bit of Louise's batter and make a checkerboard cake so I can see it. And by that time, I had annoyed her. And she turned around like the typical grandmother did. She had an apron on, and she put her hands on her hip. And she looked at me. She said, Junior, if it is not in the batter, it will not come out in the cake. Years later, you know, uh, I understood that she wasn't really talking about food. She was talking about life itself. And when you look at people and you want to change them, you have to think about, do they understand what I'm trying to do? Do they understand? Because a lot of people you can't change. And I'm a good example of that, you know. But she was not just talking about the cake and the batter, she was talking about life itself. So people that you encounter, you look at them and you can determine, if you look deep enough, as to whether or not they are even capable of understanding what you're saying. And that thought come back, and oftentimes, even now, I get into a situation, and it's like my grandmother's right next to my ear saying, if it ain't in the batter, it will not come out in the cake. And at that point, I'm no longer frustrated with them or expecting them to do something that they probably can't even do.
Got it. Okay, so tell me about another one that you used to talk to me about. Be present at every breath.
Well, the other thing from my grandmother, who had a pretty good influence on me, um, she would always say, pay attention to what you're doing. Pay attention to what you're doing. Now, and I was confused as to how do I pay attention to everything? And in a sense, she taught me to keep my mind divided into three different parts. So I'm hearing them talking, and I know what I'm talking about, and I'm fully aware of it. Uh, I know how I got here to talk about what I'm talking, but I have to know what I'm going to do next. So keep your intention before you every step you take. Your attention and your intention should not be separated. You got to think about both of them at the same time. And that way you can make a lot more progress than you could if you separated them and did them one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to add to that, why did you teach me how to play chess as opposed to checkers or any of those other games?
Well, chess makes you wonder, makes you think, why did they make that move? And one of the things I'm happy about is that I was educated before integration. Because if I came home and said to my two older sisters or my mother or father that Sherry said such and such, before they would deal with what Sherry said, they'd ask me, why do you think Sherry said that to you? Consequently, unbeknownst to me at that time, I grew up with the what and the why. And as I grew older, I understood that if you don't know why, you can't even change what. And in my way of thinking, we're 460 something years into this freedom, supposedly. And we've done a lot of things, and we've done a lot of things that were good. In fact, I am of the opinion we did better things than we did before integration. And I often think if integration was so good, then why haven't we created some more Black Wall Streets? You know, if you, what? Well, as I say when I'm talking to people, what don't mean a damn thing without why. And if
Okay.
you don't know the why, there's no way you're going to change the what. So
Okay.
you got to keep your mind open all the time.
Got it. Okay, so another one that you taught me in a whole situation with some relatives is let sleeping dogs lie. Tell me about that one.
Well, when we first moved to Atlanta, I knew I had some cousins down in Macon, Georgia. And when I left Detroit, I came by myself at first. And I remember when we got back to Detroit from the 6 weeks we spent in Atlanta, I went to work on Monday morning, and on Thursday, I called Gloria, Sherry's mother, and I said, listen, pack my bags. I'm going back to Atlanta. And she said, we can't go back to Atlanta now. I says, I didn't say we, I said me. And as soon as you sell the house, I'll come and get you. And then I, come home and my bags were packed and I went by and kissed my mother and I left. Well, when I come down for a few days, I stayed at a motel, which was very expensive. And then I found a room upstairs in this lady's house. She was renting to students, but at that time, school was out. So I moved into one of the rooms up in her attic, and her name was Miss Jules, and she was going to school me about the South and these women down here and how they'll treat you and what they'll do and where to go, what part of town to stay away from. And I listened because the way I grew up, I was pretty well streetwise, but out of deference to her, I would listen to what she said. So I told her one weekend I was going to ride down to Macon. I knew I had some cousins down to Macon. Uh, and she said, well, she says, I want to tell you, there's an old saying that went, let sleeping dogs lie. Don't wake them up, you know. And so I heard what she said, and I got my Imperial, and I shot down 75, got to Perry, and I was going down the street slowly looking at the addresses on the mailboxes. And when I got to the address, there was a bunch of people on the porch. It was the holiday weekend. It was cooking on the porch, and it was loud music, and there was cussing and carrying on, and everybody was just having a good time. So I drove on around the block, and I got out of my car, and then I came back walking on the opposite side of the street. And as I approached the house, I mean, everybody seemed to be having fun. There was a lot of drinking and a lot of whatever. And just as I got parallel to the house, trying to decide whether I was going to go over there and introduce myself, I heard Miss Jewel's voice in my ear, let sleeping dogs lie. So I kept walking. I went around the block. I got in my car and I came back to Atlanta. I was not ready to get involved with that at the time, you know, probably any time. So that's where that one come from. Let sleeping dogs lie.
And you guys, most of the things that he's telling right now, he told me a while ago. And later on, it could have been 10 years later, these same things come up. Yeah, I ran into a situation where I ran into somebody that I knew from the past, from high school or whatever. And, they wanted to, get all together. And I'm like, his voice came in, let sleeping dogs lie. Anyway, so the other one I wanted to talk about was the pendulum. You always used to talk about uh, someone taking 10 steps to the left or 10 steps to the right. So let's talk about that.
Well, it was my observation, and my intent is not to tell my children to do or not to do anything. I wanted them to think about what they were doing. And that was a part of the teaching of chess. And it didn't matter what the situation was. If they went 10 miles off to the right, I would just take them 10 miles off to the left, and then I'd leave them alone. And, they would make a decision and they'd have to live with the consequences. Because when we were learning to play chess and whatever else we did, I never let them win just because it was a child. They had to win, you know. Consequently, both of them were playing chess before they got into junior high school. And I remember the games that I used to play with them. It's just games, but I come home and I'd lay $1 on the table.
Yeah.
And then I would count to 10. And well, I'd lay $1 on the table. And then I would say, what is 3 times 5 divided by 6 times 3 plus 4? And then I would hit the table 10 times. Boom, 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 boom. And if they could guess it before I hit 10 times on the table, the money was theirs. And I remember my wife saying, that's a silly game. Why would you do that? But I remember about 3 weeks into that, and I'd do it at least once a week. About 3 weeks into it, they wanted to up the ante to 5. Game over. Game over. We ain't doing that no more. Because they was taking my money.
So tell us why you decided to leave Detroit and come to Atlanta back in the 70s, early 70s.
Well, I saw the handwriting on the wall in Detroit. Being a paper boy, and actually, I was a paper boy's helper at 10. At 12, I got my own route. And when I got my own route, it was like in my neighborhood, or my family in particular, if you had a hustle that was legitimate, it was okay to be in the street. So I went back, I got a second paper route, and I got a jet route. So I was always in the street. I was always gone, but I also, every time I came home, we all had a big punch bowl on the dining room table. I'd always put some money in the punch bowl. And everybody was so proud of me, and they thought, I was emanating my father. And that was a very small part of it. The bigger part of it is because I was putting money in the punch bowl and I was out hustling all the time. I didn't have to wash dishes, and I didn't have to take out the garbage. My only chore was in the wintertime, I had to go out and get fuel oil to put in the heater. But my hustle was so great that I bought a second fuel oil can, and I would fill it during the day and stick it under the back steps because the fuel oil was way out in the back so it wouldn't burn the house down if something happened. But I bought my own fuel oil tank that was exactly like the one we had, and I would stick it under the steps. So when I went out to get the fuel in the morning, because I had to get up early and go out and get the fuel and be sure the fire was, up when everybody got up to get dressed to go to school. So that's what I did. I was hustling. And when you're like that, it creates an inquisitive mind. How can I make money? And the things I did, it wasn't so much that I was after the money, I was after the freedom of being on my own for the most of the time. And that's what made me who I am now. I'm 81 years old, and I've only worked for somebody else for 9 years out of my whole life because I had skills. And I remember when during the civil rights movement, and I'd be looking at television and all of that, and Martin Luther King was saying, give us a job. We can do it. Give us a job. Well, I was on the block when Malcolm was about, and he would always say, increase your skill set and make a job. So I grew up in a whole neighborhood of craftsmen, and I know I spent at least 1 to 3 months with every man in the block that had different craft. And that's how I learned so many different crafts. Plus, my father was a master mechanic. My Uncle James was a master electrician. My Uncle Horace was a master cabinet maker and a carpenter. And my Uncle Elmo was a plumber. And, you know, I worked with them because they would pay me, you know. But back then, anytime a grown up saw a kid that wanted to know what they were doing, they would teach them. And they would teach them gladly. Well, I remember my uncles and my father always sparring, not really arguing, but going back and forth. And my father was for sure I was going to be a master mechanic. And my uncle James always said, well, electricians make more money and they don't get dirty, they don't have grease under their fingernails, and all this was going on. I had more access to them two than I did my Uncle Elmo and my Uncle Horace. My Uncle Elmo was a plumber, and he didn't get to mastery because he was self-taught. But he taught me a different way of looking at things because he said that there was no difference between plumbing and electrical. And I looked at him and I wanted to say, you're crazy because electricity will shock you. You know, and he said, well, it will shock you. He said, but when you look at the drawings of the schematics, they're all the same. He says, one, you're sending electrical current, the other one, you're sending fluid. So what's the difference? What you need to concentrate on is what you want to happen at the end that you're sending, whether it be electrical or plumbing. You want the toilet to flush? You want the lights to come on? That's forget about the rest of that. It's the same thing. And I thought about that. But then when I got to high school, I asked the shop teacher what was the overall best trade ever. I didn't know that word awesome back then. And he looked at me and he said, well, William, that will be the tool maker. Well, I'd been around a lot of craftsmen, but I had never heard of a tool maker. And so I asked him, well, what make that the overall best trade ever? Big German guy. He kind of bent over and looked straight in my eyes. He said, William, no trade moves before the tool maker makes the tools. And a bell went off in my head. And I could see in the ninth grade where I could jump over my father and all three of my uncles. So that's what I did. I knew in the ninth grade what I was going to do when I got out of school. And I honed in and focused on it. And that's what I became. And the tool maker actually is the high end of the blue collar market. And they will make more money than the lower third of the white collar market because there's not a lot of people that can concentrate at that level. And if you really get good at it, you can be a tool maker. And I say that for about 15 years, I worked in tenths of a thousand without a computer. And what that means, if you take one hair off your head and split it 3 times, and then take one of those and split it 10 times, that's where I live. That's where my thinking is. That's the way I measure things. And that's the way I choose, you know.
So you saw something going on back then in Detroit that made you move here. What exactly was that with all of the knowledge that you had about what was going on in industry then?
Well, in industry back at that time, um, I realized that uh, I couldn't have my own shop. You know, me and 2 other fellows started a shop. And when we wasn't making any money, everything was fine. We started out making about $300 a week, and then when we got to $1,300 a week, you know, things were still fine. Nobody bothered us. But when we got to $3,000 a week, everybody come around and wanted to help. And when we said no, thank you, they bought the building and set us in the street. The other thing, I was a part of Henry Ford Junior Engineering Society, and we got a magazine once a month. And 2 articles that shocked me, and one was the agony of the overskilled man. That's when Boeing was laying off all these technicians, and they kept the engineers, but they were laying off the technicians and all of the line workers and all of that. And I realized, even though I wasn't at Boeing, I was in a job shop, that I was one of those overskilled men. The owner of the shop told me one day, and the shop I grew up in, It was a world-class machine shop, world class. But there was nothing in there black but me and the floor. And the owner said to me one day, he said, well, William, he says, I got to admit, you're one of the best mill hands that we ever had. And me being cocky and solid in my trade, I said, well, if that be true, why do I make $1 less than everybody else in here? And that's the first time I noticed that he was angry. And he said, don't worry about what them other guys making. He said, 20 years from now, they're going to still be there turning the handle. And I said to myself, well, damn, I'm not even going to get any seniority in this place either, huh? You know. But later on, I realized that he saw more in me than I saw in myself. You know, the second article was Go South, Young Man, Go South. Now, there was at Detroit College of Applied Science, there was about 700 students because you had to be sponsored to go there. And the second article was Go South, Young Man, Go South. And I didn't think they were talking to me because there was only 11 blacks in the whole school. And I read the article anyway, but that's when I found out that in the Southeast, there were right to work states. You didn't have to be a part of the union and you didn't have to pay union dues and you didn't have to, but if everybody got a raise, then you still got a raise too. I said, so being that I couldn't have my own shop, being that I could see IT coming in and taking over the simpler jobs, I had gotten out of close tolerance tooling and machining and got into mold making. And I like mold making because you didn't need 1,000 of them. You make one mold and you can make 10,000 pieces with that one mold. And I thought I was safe then. But when I realized that there was no constraints on you in the South, you know, whatever you do, you could do it, and wasn't nobody going to try to keep you from doing it if you were good at it. And so that's when I decided it was time to get out of Detroit. I mean, there were a lot of other things happen because even though I had been there 5 years, they were still giving me hell in certain aspects because this was in the 60s. And because I was the only one, the older guys was fascinated and wondering how I knew what I knew. And the younger guys, they were intimidated. And so there was no fit. In fact, at school and at work, I felt like a fly in a glass of milk most of the time, but it was all right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what made me be better because I would concentrate, I would look deeper, and I would always do more than I was supposed to.
Gotcha. So finally, this is the last question. What would you say to the young people, specifically to the young Black men and women that are here in the United States in 2024 about how they can thrive in 2025, about their relationships, about finances, about everything? When you talk to young people, which we had some people over last night, what would be the wisdom that you would give the young people that are out there? And when I say young, I'm talking all the way from 20 even to 50. What would you tell these people?
Well, I would tell them that time is moving faster now than it ever has. And there is a lot of opportunity out there. And you have to look at that opportunity and figure out what you want to do and understand you may have to do something else to do what you want to do. And as I was saying last night, you may have to do this in order to do that. That's where the delayed gratification come in. And once you get skilled at whatever you do, and this is one of the things my father told me. He told me this a long time ago. He said, before you can master anything, you have to become one with it. And I didn't really understand what that meant back when I was doing it. But as I listened closer and I questioned him more and some of the other craftsmen to become one with it means to have such a focus and a feel for what you're doing. You know, I used to do machining, and when I was practicing become one with it, I would put my hand on the machine that I was running, and I'd be looking around the shop or reading a book or whatever. But when that vibration in that machine changed, I can tell you when the cutter was getting dull. That's when you can become one with it. And that's also when I realized that the majority of the people out there don't like what they're doing. And I couldn't imagine, well, why would they keep doing it? And then I learned about the golden handcuffs. And the golden handcuffs is when you don't make enough money to really live well, but you make too much money to quit. And you're stuck. Don't get stuck. Don't get stuck. You gotta, as my father said, keep getting up. Just keep getting up. And you can progress, you can do whatever you want to do. And at that point, that's when you become free. That's when you become free, because as I look back over my time, I can't see any time that I'd ever done anything that I didn't want to do more than 2 days, because I always could do something else. And I didn't mind stepping out there, because when you keep your intention ahead of you all the time, then you have the confidence to keep just do something else. You know, if you don't like doing it, do something else.
If you don't like where you are at point A, go to point B. That's what
right. That's right.
That's what you taught me, and that's what you did. So I want you guys down in the comment section to let me know whether you want him to have a YouTube channel. So thanks a lot, Dad. Thank you.
Okay.
And you all let me know what you think, and you all have a great day.